45, almost hour time that we have together, right? I really want to make sure that all of us are able to take away things that are tangible and things that they can implement right away. All my content, how I show up online, that's really what I try and focus on. But maybe before we do that, I should probably introduce myself. So I always actually spell out my name. So it's Akua. My father, who's from Ghana, calls me Ikria. My mom, who's from the US, calls me Akua, and I've grown up primarily in Francophone West Africa, spent a little bit of time in North Africa as well. And I've also had a chance to live and work in Nigeria for a few years, and they tend to refer to me as Aqua. Not picky about it. I respond to any and all. I actually will even change my name depending on where I am. I am a certified executive and leadership coach. I'm also a recognized facilitator and speaker. And one of the things that I started realizing was that I could really leverage social media to build my business. And I think it's really important to share that because there are so many different ways in which you can leverage LinkedIn. There's so many different ways that you can leverage social media. And one of the things that I found myself doing when I first started was really comparing myself to other people that I saw online, not even necessarily comparing myself to other coaches, but just other people in general. And so one of the first things that I did that I think really helped me in leveraging a platform, and I decided to focus in on LinkedIn, was making sure that I was leveraging LinkedIn for my business, not necessarily leveraging it to be an influencer, not necessarily leveraging it for the number of followers, but really leveraging it so that I could make more money and impact more people through my business. I'm going to share a little bit more about some of the mistakes that I made and share a little bit more about some of the things I would really suggest that you focus on, especially if you're a time-strapped coach. And I add always that element or that resource of time because I tend to focus on supporting leaders and executives with productivity. I define it more as self-management and energy management, but most of my clients will talk about it from the perspective of being time poor or not as productive. So everything that I'm going to be sharing today, and of course, everything that you share as well, is really going to direct this conversation. So at this point, I'd actually love to turn it over to everyone. And maybe if everyone could just maybe spend maybe just 1 minute introducing yourself, maybe let me know a little bit more about your niche. And also let me know the last time that you touched LinkedIn, because that is really our focus for the conversation today. Who would like to go first?
I'll jump in.
Awesome.
Since I joined late, I can pay the penalty. Nice to meet you. I appreciate your introduction. I am, of course, an executive coach. The last time I touched LinkedIn was about a minute ago because I thought this was a LinkedIn learning. I couldn't find the link. That's why I was late, because I thought, okay. I don't know why I got LinkedIn Learning and ICF mixed up. Apologies, ICF friends. I'm a Fortune 100 executive, actually recently departed, so I can go all in on executive coaching, leadership development, authoring a book on leadership. And so I'd be keen to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that as well, how to use LinkedIn to get the word out. I mean, obviously I could post it, but there must be some tricks that I might not be thinking about. So that's my quick minute. Nice to meet you and nice to see everybody on the call.
Amazing, Phil. Thank you so much for jumping in. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about what you're looking to do on LinkedIn.
Thanks.
Awesome. Who's next?
I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Susanna.
Oh, hi, Jill. Well, I am a leadership coach. I also coach individuals on stress management and personal growth. And I think LinkedIn has become my main go-to social media outlet. I've kind of left behind all the others because I feel that this is the one that focuses more on professional. It's more professional. However, it's been a while since I've been posting, and I want to get back to being more proactive and having more of a presence.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Susanna. Jill, would you like to go next?
Yes, and I'm sorry I don't have the video on. I'm kind of en route here, so so you get to see my, hopefully, picture up there. I'm an executive and career coach. I use LinkedIn. I use it pretty regularly. I'm probably not leveraging it as efficiently as I could. I do articles and, link it to a blog that I do every month. I'd love to be able to use it to get a little bit more traffic and just leverage that in a more impactful way. For me, It definitely is for business, but I do actually want to utilize LinkedIn to be more of an influencer around a lot of the topics that I write about that affect women leaders. So it's kind of a twofold purpose for LinkedIn for me. So I'm really interested to get some insights and some best practices from you. So thank you for facilitating this program.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this, Jill. And thank you for, even joining us, even though you're en route. Awesome. Who's next?
I'll go next because I mimic a lot of what Jill said. So I'm an executive. I'm still full-time VP of Finance. I am starting my coaching business on the side. I use LinkedIn all the time I'm also on a board, women's leadership board, and a lot of the communication, a lot of the sessions that we host on a monthly basis, we communicate through LinkedIn. So very much my professional network, that's where I'm at. But yes, I don't use it to the capabilities. I'm still using the free service. I'm not paying for it, trying to minimize costs all around. So that's what I'm doing.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I will say, I've actually never paid for LinkedIn myself. There are coaches who do focus on LinkedIn strategies that involve paid strategies. I've never done that. So I'm happy to sort of share my perspective around that as well. All right. Who's next? Go ahead, Shirley.
Hi, I'm Shirley Bell, and I am new to the coaching field, and I'm actually a master certified neuro-linguistic programming coach, and right now I'm actually have been sensing my niche to be more towards spiritual life coach. And the last time I touched LinkedIn, I'll be honest, I only touch LinkedIn like when I get emails, like when they say, oh, somebody was in the search or you was in the search. But I just touched it last week because I was updating my resume and so forth. So I've never really paid attention to LinkedIn. I'm kind of one of those where I just have Facebook, and anything outside of that is kind of a bit much. So this is something that's kind of, I guess, right on time, because I never thought of LinkedIn as a resource and so forth for business practice. And also my family, my mom is from Ghana.
Oh,
so
okay.
Yeah, my mom is from Ghana, and well, technically she was born in Nigeria, but she was raised in Ghana. And my father and his family is from Nigeria. So yeah, we're Igbo. So
amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing.
Neat. I love these connections, and thanks, Akua, for being here. So I'm a leadership development coach and consultant. I help leaders pull out of the day-to-day spin to slow down and really build trust and therefore increase their productivity. And I'm on LinkedIn all the time too.
Amazing. Great. Amazing. This is a really great, I think, diverse session, and I'm very excited to be able to speak to, I think, some of these different ways in which you can approach LinkedIn based on what you've shared. Please feel free, honestly, at any point in time throughout this conversation, because I do have a bit of, I guess you can say, teaching component that I would like to share with everyone, but please feel free at any point in time to contribute in the chat. You're also welcome to interrupt me as well. But what I'm really going to try and do throughout this entire conversation, like I said, part of it will be a bit of me teaching or sort of sharing some of my thoughts and some mind shifts that I think might be helpful for some of you on here. You are, just welcome to ask questions, and I will try to make sure that I actually provide the majority of our time to asking questions. So I'm not going to be going through everything, and there's going to be some parts that I maybe click through quickly. That's simply just because I don't think it's necessarily as relevant for our conversation. All right. So what I'm going to start off with is by sharing my screen and sort of sharing, I think, the 3 massive mistakes I think that everyone should avoid when trying to generate leads on LinkedIn or really thinking about building out their presence in their profile. And another thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that your profile is separate, I think, from your presence, right? So your profile is really that static piece, and that presence, it's more about how you want to engage, how much time you actually want to spend on the platform, and the type of content that you want to produce. And as I go through these slides, you'll see that there's so many different ways really to show up on LinkedIn, but the key is that you need to decide for yourself. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Hopefully everyone can see it. We're going to play from current slide. I think it's fair to start here. And we're really just going to start off with what I describe as the massive mistakes. And once again, this is going to look a little bit different for everybody. And even with this first one, it actually might not be as relevant for Phil, but I'll talk through why. Okay. So the first mistake I think a lot of us make really on LinkedIn is really focusing on the number of followers as a strategy. All right. And let me tell you a little bit why a lot of us do this. We do this because it seems like other thought leaders, other coaches, other, service providers might be focusing on numbers, or it seems like they're focusing on numbers. For others, we might be thinking to ourselves, hey, maybe there's this correlation between the more followers and more potential clients and opportunities. And this is really where I want to pause and just make a distinction. If you are a service provider, right, and the primary service or the primary product that you have is selling your time in terms of coaching or programs, there's only a limited amount of time and a limited number of programs that you can sell. So it's really important to recognize that you're not really looking necessarily for more followers, right? It's more about potential clients, right? And so more followers may not lead to more potential clients, right? It's really about focusing on quality versus quantity if your primary product is not something that's scalable. On the flip side, right, if you're someone like Phil who wants to maybe sell a book, or you have a course that doesn't include you, right, that's very scalable, thinking about the number of followers might make a little bit more sense. Okay, just wanted to make that distinction there, right? Once again, if you're selling mostly coaching packages or courses that are live where you actually have to be a part of it, more followers is really not where you should be focusing. On the flip side, if you have a book, something that's more mass market, where you're not actually exchanging your time for money, focusing on the number of followers really might make more sense, right? Why else might we focus on followers, right? We might focus on followers because we don't actually know how to strategically find the relevant opportunities or clients, okay? What's going to happen if you just focus on followers? And once again, I made that distinction between Phil and maybe the rest of us that are on here, is you're really going to burn out because you're not going to have selected a clear way forward. You're just going to be focused on how many people can I get following me? How many people can I get connected? As opposed to thinking about it from the perspective of how many of these are actually my ideal clients or ideal decision makers. Thanks, Phil, for that. Yes. And I will distinguish between those two in a second. Another thing that might happen if you don't take the time to really think about what your strategy is and what product you're actually going to sell is your content will not be useful for market research. Once again, as I've mentioned before, I am a coach that leverages LinkedIn. I don't have a book. I don't have a scalable course. So from my perspective, I use all of my content as market research. And what I mean by that is I'm looking at who's engaging with it. I'm looking at who's commenting on it. And I'm looking at them as potential clients, right? And they're also giving me an indication about where my content might need to go as well, right? Once again, if you're focused so much on followers and you don't have a product that's scalable, your business and brand will probably be in the same exact place as it is now, all right? And I'd love to pause here and just actually tune into something that Phil actually posted in the chat. And I think this is a really good point to distinguish. One thing that LinkedIn has done recently is they've given people the opportunity to have followers as opposed to connections. And the reason why they've made this distinction is because similar to a lot of other social media websites, they want pretty much LinkedIn influencers. And once again, influencers aren't necessarily selling services. They're not necessarily selling one-off services or one-on-one services or services that aren't as scalable. They typically are looking for maybe visibility, and they may be monetizing their presence and influence in other ways. And so LinkedIn has given people the opportunity to have both connections. And so those are people who are connecting with you and you need to accept them, versus followers who are maybe just looking at your content. I'd love to pause here and just make sure. Any questions about this?
I actually have a question. I have a question.
I feel like I've thrown a lot.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
This is very, very interesting. And I'm just really thinking, what if your goal is really both? Because I think I'm just thinking of kind of my goals for myself is definitely clients, but also a desire to have followers for maybe something that's scalable. So is it a either or can it be a this and?
That's a great question. And I'm actually going to get to that when I get to sort of the three-step process that I go through. From my perspective, I think that I'll just answer the question just earlier on and we'll reiterate. I think that you need to decide and sort of have times, so time-bound goals for specific time periods where you're focusing on certain things on LinkedIn. So for example, I typically do things quarterly. So I spent the first quarter really focused on pushing. I do have a LinkedIn course that I have. So I spent the first quarter really pushing that. And now I'm going back to simply just nurturing my audience and just trying to build my mailing list, right? So you can really choose your own goals. And I'll talk a little bit more about why it's so important actually to choose a time-bound goal. I'm sure a lot of you on here do that with your clients, but it's not something that we necessarily think about leveraging and actually implementing on LinkedIn. So I'll get to that, but that's a really great question. All right. So this is what I would suggest you do instead, right? In relation to this one specific goal. And I feel like I'm reiterating what I've shared already. Select a clear time-bound strategy to reduce the amount of time and energy that you spend on LinkedIn. So if you've decided that you really want to focus on number of followers, then you want to really make sure that you're pushing content that you think is going to get a lot of engagement, a lot of people interested. And maybe in terms of how you're showing up on LinkedIn, what you're really doing is adding people. So anyone who's engaging with your content, commenting on your content, if they're not already connected or following you, maybe you're asking them, hey, would you like to follow my content? Or hey, would you like to connect? Another key thing that you want to make sure that you do is connect with relevant companies and people. And you really are doing this to accelerate trust. And so that's why it's so important that you have a clear idea of who your ideal decision maker or ideal client is. I like to use the word, ideal decision maker, because actually the majority of my work is B2B, not B2C, right? And B2B simply is that I work primarily with other businesses, not necessarily other individuals. And even when I work with individuals, it's usually businesses that are actually paying me. And so that's something that I keep in mind as I'm posting content and as I'm thinking about the people I'm connecting with. Right. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a few next slides. Another thing that you want to keep in mind to make sure that you're making the most of whoever's following you or whoever's connected with you is that you really are thinking about what is that one action I'd like that ideal client to make. And it should be relevant and related to whatever that strategy that you have. Once again, I'll share an example of that moving forward. All right. Another mistake that a lot of us make, and I know this is something that I used to do a lot, but it's so important that you focus on yourself. As I mentioned before, right, I spent a lot of time potentially copying other thought leaders, but I didn't really understand the context. And because of that, what I was doing wasn't really converting. So you do this, right, because you see it maybe works for other people, or you think it works for other people. Maybe you don't know where to start. But the key thing here is that if you do that, what will happen is that you'll constantly be scrambling to try something new because somebody else is doing it. And you also will probably spend a lot more time creating content as opposed to nurturing opportunities, right? And nurturing relationships, because ultimately that's what's going to lead to more business if you were focused on more of that one-to-one or more of those group programs that aren't necessarily as scalable, right? And ultimately what that means is that you'll be annoyed, you'll be tired, and maybe upset that the content that you're producing isn't isn't creating the results or generating the results that you want. So the key thing here when it comes to thinking about content is the first and foremost is you need to decide whether or not you want to create original content. And I actually tell a lot of new people or people who are getting back into LinkedIn that you don't need to create original content. And I'll share some ideas of what you can do there, but there's so many other ways to leverage LinkedIn, both publicly and privately, without creating any content. A huge part of that already is just making sure that you have a feed that's optimized. And by a feed that's optimized, what I mean is that you are, following people that you think are inspiring, or you're following ideal clients, or you're following the pages of companies that you think could potentially work with you, or you like their content. That already will give you exposure to potential opportunities, right? Because what will happen is that your feed will be full of people maybe who are looking for a trainer or a speaker, right? And on the flip side, if you see someone post something that says, hey, we're looking for a trainer or we're looking for an innovative leadership course, you will be able to see that in your feed. And you can do that once again without creating any original content. That's just about engaging with your feed. Another thing you want to make sure that you do is you keep your ideal decision maker or your ideal client in mind when you're creating content, right? So what's going to resonate with them? And really just recognize, right? And this is something that I always have to keep in mind as a coach, is that you need to create content that's going to resonate with them where they actually are, right? A lot of times, if you look on LinkedIn, I see this with some of my content, the only other people that are engaging with my content are other coaches. That's not necessarily a bad thing if you're looking to sell your services to other coaches. But if only coaches are potentially engaging with your content, you might potentially have an issue, and there might be an opportunity there for you to rethink some of the things that you're sharing, because it's so important for us to recognize that a lot of the ideal decision makers, ideal clients we're working with may not use the same words and may not be where we are describing some of the things that we can support them with. The last piece that you want to keep in mind in terms of your content, no matter where you are within your content journey or your thought leadership journey or your service provider journey, is that there are 3 basic types of content that you want to produce. And I'll share a little bit more about this moving forward, but you want to create content that introduces you, reinforces your expertise. And then last but not least, you want to make sure that you provide social proof. And you can do this once again, both on your profile and also in your presence as you're creating content or sharing content from other people. All right, Suzanne, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
What is social proof?
Great question. So social proof typically is a screenshot of somebody else saying how amazing you are. That's probably the easiest way to describe it, but it can be a testimonial. It can be feedback. It's probably something that a lot of you have seen. And I know for me in my sort of leadership journey or thought leadership journey or entrepreneurial journey, it's taken me now almost 4 years to get comfortable sharing those screenshots. I didn't feel comfortable doing it previously. I always actually ask for permission. But that's something that a lot of service providers do. And it helps to just bridge that trust gap, because the idea is that if you see other people saying, hey, this person's awesome, that also means you're awesome. But you can also get social proof by asking for testimonials as well. And then the easiest way to see that on LinkedIn, the LinkedIn profile, are the recommendations. So all of those would be considered social proof. Yeah. Jill, I see that you unmuted.
Yes, I think you clarified it, but I've never heard of the concept of screenshot. I've always asked for, I've sent requests for recommendation, and that's where I usually include that. But are you suggesting that there's an alternative way to do that? What do you mean by it specifically?
Yeah, I'm suggesting if you're comfortable with it, especially if you do virtual work, sometimes people will say things in the chat, or you'll have a presenter or facilitator that says, hey, can you let me know like what you're taking away from this conversation? Yeah, you could definitely screenshot that. And that's something that I've seen people use as content, and also share in emails and other forms as well. And once again, that's I don't think it's any less valid than getting a testimonial or feedback, but because it's something that was written by somebody else, it's an image of it. In some people's mind, that might be more legitimate. And I don't think that's the best word to use, but that's the word that's coming to mind. You might also see it, people will comment maybe on a post, and you'll see other people, once again, authentic. Thank you for that, Carrie. Yeah, maybe it's more authentic, right? Because it's their words directly. You haven't prompted them in any way necessarily, and it's just there. But you'll also see it sometimes people will, comment on someone's post, say this was awesome, or you helped change my life, screenshot of that, and you'll see other people creating content and posts around that. So that's something you can definitely keep in mind. All right. The last thing that I think a lot of, especially time-strapped coaches, don't necessarily spend as much time on is their profile. And I'd really recommend that this is something that you think a little bit about. In my 3-step process I'll share with you, I actually suggest thinking about your profile last, because I think the first step is really your strategy, and then deciding what content or how you want to engage actually on LinkedIn. And then the last step is really making sure that your profile reinforces whatever content that you share and reinforces the strategy that you select. So a lot of people say to themselves, well, the only people that look at profiles are like full-time employers. It's not true. I get a lot of people looking actually at my profile and be like, hey, I like that piece, or that was really, really, important for me, and that's why I reached out. Okay. So really make sure you are thinking about your profile. Other people maybe say, hey, they're not sure where to start, so they just don't start anywhere, right? It's some kind of like this analysis paralysis, or maybe even perfectionism. But the key thing here is that you want to make sure that your profile speaks to your ideal client or your ideal decision maker. And you really will miss out on opportunities if it's not optimized, right? I don't want to go down this. There's a lot of work that can go into thinking about how to optimize your profile. But the key thing here is that people do search on LinkedIn. And so you want to make sure that you're using the right keywords for your profile. Once again, when we get to the Q&A section, we can talk a little bit more about that. But the key thing here is that there is a distinction between the types of words that will be used in different industries. So for example, I work primarily with fast growing startups, right? So one of the keywords that a lot of people within the fast growing startup space uses is high performing teams. We talk constantly about scaling, high performing teams, those are the keywords that people are using. So those are the types of things that I want to make sure that I'm using in my content and also in my profile. And another thing, right, is we want to make sure that our profile really reinforces our expertise, because what's going to happen is that someone's going to look at your content if you've decided to post content and then go straight to your profile. But if your profile doesn't reinforce your content, you're going to lose trust, and people are not going to reach out because they're going to be really confused about the value you provide and maybe even your services. So I'm going to share the top 5 areas that you could look at. I also really recommend that you upgrade your recommendations. if that's something that you want to leverage your profile for. So for example, one person I know on here is still working full time, but if you want to use your profile for, coaching, you want to make sure that you're starting to ask people and be very intentional about, hey, can you write me a recommendation that's specifically related to my coaching? Right? There's nothing wrong with having previous recommendations on there. I do, but you want to just make sure that it does speak to the services or whatever you're looking to provide. So for example, my previous recommendations speak to my job as a former co-founder and managing director. That's helpful for the work I do, right? Because I'm working primarily with founders and C-suite startup executives. So they can see what previous supervisors or previous founders thought about my work, right? And then last but not least, I also recommend that you go and think about leveraging LinkedIn low budget, right? I am not someone who spends a lot of money on pictures. The majority of the pictures that you actually see on my profile and even the things I share, those are pictures I took myself. And I just share this because for a lot of, especially executive and leadership clients, and coaches, I know a lot of them are thinking to themselves, I need to show up and look a certain way in order to be successful. I didn't share the companies I've worked with, but I've worked with a lot of amazing companies and brands, and I don't think my actual visuals are that great, and I haven't invested that much in it. So don't sort of use that as an excuse not to put yourself out there, right? I'm not suggesting that you don't invest, but I'm just suggesting that you do it sooner rather than later and put yourself out there. And then later on, you can invest in getting a better photographer and maybe a graphic designer to help you put together your banner. But there's a lot of free resources out there, and I'm happy to share some of them if that's something that's sort of holding you back. All right. So how do you do this, right? What does this look like? Just going straight for it. 3 basic steps, right? And as I mentioned before, we've already gone through them. So I'm going to zip through this really quickly. The first is really making sure that you select a strategy. The second is honestly deciding whether or not you want to create original content. And it's not necessary for everyone, especially if you don't have a lot of time. And the third is making sure that you're auditing your profile and you're thinking about how often do I actually want to update it, right? You have that control. You get to decide what consistent looks like. You get to decide how often you show up. And I will just say, because I'm sure a lot of you that spend a little bit of time on LinkedIn are looking at potential people and you're saying, oh my gosh, this person posts so much, like what's happening? And I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about the strategy behind that, but I promise you they are not on LinkedIn every single hour. They probably have a team behind them and they're leveraging tools and technologies to support them in that way. And I also promise you that in terms of their strategy, they're probably thinking about more mass market products, right? More products that probably don't involve their time and their energy every single day. All right, so I describe it as up-leveling your LinkedIn. What does this actually look like? All right. So really the first step is asking yourself, why am I on LinkedIn? And this sort of goes to Jill's question about, can we do more than one thing at a time? I'd really recommend to start off with that you just focus on one key strategy. As I mentioned before, I try to do it on a quarterly basis. You can decide on whatever time period works for you, but it's really important that you just select a time period, right? You get very specific about what you want to do on LinkedIn, right? And then you give yourself time to check in to see whether or not it's actually getting you closer to your goals. The key thing here also is that I'd recommend that you don't necessarily focus on vanity metrics unless, once again, you have a mass market product or it's part of your strategy, right? You have something that you're selling or there's another sort of piece to what you're doing that doesn't involve selling a non-scalable service. All right. So if these are some of the things that you're doing, that's absolutely fine. Once again, it's really just going to be focused on what you're trying to do on there. And I know some of you have already shared some of the things that you're trying to do on there. So in terms of fill mass market product, the awesome thing about having a book, honestly, is that you can actually draw and reuse and repurpose and recycle the content that you have in your book, right? So you can actually leverage a, tool like Buffer. There's a lot of tools out there. Hire maybe a VA, or you can even do this on, yourself on a monthly basis or even a quarterly basis, where you just extract some of your quotes, and that can be some of your content. And you can have a quick call to action that said something along the lines of, if you enjoyed this, or this is something that resonates, I have an entire book that you can invest in, or, check out this book that has more pieces to add to this, right? So that could be one strategy that you use. I also know that there's some amazing influencers and service providers out there that have actually leveraged LinkedIn to build their book. So they actually will put chapters of their book on LinkedIn and see how people respond and react to it. And that gives them, once again, an idea of how to leverage whatever they're putting together, right? And it draws up interest as well. So there's so many ways in which you can do it, but I really would recommend that you just really think really hard about what is that one strategy I want to use it for? Do I want to reshare, right? Do I want to drum up interest? And that might look a little bit different about how you show up. Another one maybe that I will just touch on before we get to that next step of really thinking about that content is, if you are thinking about being a little bit more of an influencer, then you probably want to touch topics that are very, very topical, right? So one of the things, once again, that I decided on in my business was that I didn't really want to touch a lot of topics that were really current. But if you want a lot of eyeballs, if you want a lot of visibility, if you want a lot of people engaging with what you're doing, you want to touch on topics that are very, very topical and things that are probably in the news and how they're relevant to how you're showing up as a coach or how they're relevant to your clients right now. That's something that's going to probably get you a lot of eyeballs and a lot of engagement. And once again, a lot of visibility and probably a lot of followers. All right. So they're just two quick examples of how you can think about strategy and how you just very much want to break it down. Right. Some other ways to think about your why, right? So one of the reasons why you might be on LinkedIn is to accelerate trust. So you can, ultimately get additional clients. That's going to look really different, right, than just building an online reputation, right? Or that influence. And last but not least, you could also think about it from the perspective of, okay, hey, ultimately, I want to increase my newsletter subscribers, so I want some more connections. And so with the next slide, I just give an example. And I will say it's a bad example, but I like to share it because it just gives you an idea of how you can think about breaking down a strategy and how at the end of this time-bound period, you decide the strategy is a bad one. And this was a bad one, I will tell you. It worked, but it was a bad one. So what I decided one of the first times I was on LinkedIn was I wanted to increase the number of newsletter subscribers I had. So I built this whole process of I would post something, ask people to comment, and then after they commented, I would ask them to join my newsletter. There are obviously much better ways to do this, right? So I could have just built an opt-in page and sent the opt-in page and got, and captured people's email addresses that way. But the reason why I like sharing this is because this was definitely something that I tried. I think I did this for about 2 to 3 months, right? I saw results, but it also was very time consuming. So that was one strategy, right, that I used for a specific period of time and decided not to use it moving forward. Okay. And that's really what I'd recommend that you think about doing, whether you work by yourself or you have other people that support you within your team, but just selecting one key thing to really focus on. All right. So what could this look like? Once again, just another way of reflecting on it. Accelerate trust. So people are saying, hey, I want to hire her. Build your influence and reputation. So, hey, this person can remember you for the next time maybe they need a coach or the next time they need a trainer. And then finally make connections. And ultimately you want them to think, hey, I know who to recommend her to, right? Her content, her profile really makes me understand who I can recommend her to if necessary. All right. And just a key reframe or something I always just love to share here is that recognizing that no one can read your mind. So when it comes to your content, it comes to your profile, you really want to make it super easy and you want to make that next step very straightforward. And typically within this space, we're talking about CTAs or calls to action, right? So you really just want to make it clear, what is that next step? Should they send you a direct message? Should they get in touch with you via this email? Should they, follow up via this website? You want to make it as clear as possible because your potential clients, your ideal decision makers, people who are engaging with your content are not mind readers and neither are you, right? So when we can flip this on its head, when you're looking at other potentially influencers or service providers, you have no idea what's going on in their head. So, don't just copy their content without context. And I think this is such a great visual when it comes to thinking about this, right? Really just recognizing that you have no idea what's going on behind what you see on LinkedIn, right? There's so many things that go on. So you can't just copy, right? You really need to decide for yourself, what is your strategy? Think about the existing content maybe that you already have and how you can leverage that, all right? I'd love to pause here and sort of see any questions, any thoughts before I move on. To the next two. And the next one I'm going to have to go through a little bit quicker just to make up for time.
What is an IG post?
So that's an Instagram post in this case. Yeah.
That proves I'm not on it.
Just abbreviating it. Yeah. So some people, refer to LinkedIn as LI, IG would be Instagram. Yeah. Susanna, please.
No questions.
Okay. You unmuted.
Closer to the screen to read the fine print.
Okay. All right. I think, like I said, I just think this is a great visual, just how it's such a waste of time for us to focus on others, just really focus on ourselves and what our own strategy is and move from there. All right. So quick one. We actually already answered this because I asked everyone, when was the last time you were on LinkedIn, but just reflect on this. When was the last time you posted on LinkedIn? And I think the key thing here is that you don't necessarily need to. right? If you see other people doing it, that's great. You might not need to, right? You might not be in the season. Your business might not be there. You may not even want to create that content, and that's fine. If you do decide to create your content and you do have a lot of content already created, so for example, you already have a blog, you've already sent out newsletters, you already have a course created or a book created, I'd really recommend that you repurpose, you reuse, and you recycle. Okay. And that's something that I already do. And I've only been doing this for about 4 years. Literally, I do not create much new content. A lot of the stuff I'm recycling and I'm repositioning and just shifting the message and maybe call to action a bit. All right. And so if you do decide to create content as well, I really would recommend that you batch and you schedule content in advance as much as you can. Okay. Once again, this is going to save you a lot of time and a lot of energy, especially if you already have this content created. Another thing you want to make sure that you do, especially if you're not creating content consistently or however you define it, is you want to follow up on likes and comments, right? Because that's really, at the end of the day, please excuse how blunt this is, but that's really where the money is, right? If you are looking to sell a service or product, you want to make sure that you're engaging and building those connections with whoever is liking and commenting. And I'd really recommend you get into the DMs, right? The direct messages, and ask them what you like, what do you dislike, what do you want to see more of? All right, Dahlia, please go ahead. Did I pronounce that correctly? Yeah.
You did.
Okay.
You did. That was great. And I was trying to find the raise my hand. So I was focused on quality and connections. And so when I ignore somebody that reaches out and says, I want to connect with you on LinkedIn, I've never met them, and it's a recruiter or a headhunter or somebody that hasn't made that connection with me, how does that impact my reputation? Does it? Basic question.
That's a great question. Yeah, no, I don't think it impacts your reputation at all. I think it's up to you to decide who you add and who you don't add. I think it's just a question of, once again, are you just looking to have more people follow you because you have more of a mass market product, you have a book or something that might be relevant? Or do you want to be a little bit more, and the word isn't necessarily intentional, but that's just what's coming to mind.
It is.
Honestly, it's more time consuming and maybe a little bit more intentional with who you connect with. And once again, that's really up to you. I will say straight up, as soon as you put coach or consultant on your profile, all of a sudden, all sorts of people will start finding you, following you, and trying to connect with you. So you best believe there's people I do not connect with, and you best believe there are people I block, I mute, and I unfollow. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I actually have another presentation I do for a bit of a different audience where literally that's all I repeat, because we're talking a little bit more about how to make sure you maintain your sanity, leveraging social media, and you maintain your productivity. So I really recommend that you can add someone, but you can always disconnect, you can always unfollow, you can always do that. So don't feel bad doing that after the fact. If you realize that they're sharing content that doesn't resonate, or they're reaching out to you in the DMs with really slimy and disgusting sort of sales approaches.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for the validation there.
Yeah, go ahead. So in terms of really thinking about your content, right? If you are going to create content, I'd really just recommend you keep your ideal client or your ideal decision maker in mind. Okay. Remember, you don't have to produce original content. You can reshare other people's content. You can find other content online, link to it, and share a little bit of your own perspective. And at the end of the day, you get to define what consistent means for you based, once again, on your strategy. Okay. Based on your strategy. That's really what should guide how you show up, what you share at the end of the day. I really wouldn't recommend sharing for the sake of sharing. I don't think that makes any sense. I don't think it's helpful for you. And I don't think that builds trust with whatever audience you've already built. All right. So there are 3 basic types of content from my perspective. I think that most content on LinkedIn can really fit within one of these buckets. The first is really around that self-promotion content. This is massive on LinkedIn. All right. The second, and this is probably the hardest to do, I know it's the hardest for me, is sort of the sell your services and products, but you have to be very direct about it. I think a lot of times I used to beat around the bush when I first started. And I think a lot of coaches beat around the bush, but you just have to put it out there if you want people to know what you're doing and you want them to potentially invest in you. And then last but not least, there's a lot of this content as well. That's where you're teaching, you're coaching, or you're sharing resources. So just quick examples of this. This first one I put on here, I think this is from about 2 years ago or so. It got so much visibility. It's crazy how many people are excited to celebrate you when you're celebrating yourself, right? At the end of the day, that's what self-promotion is all about. Sharing the value that you can provide so you can show other people what you could potentially do for them. All right. The second one here, like I said, the selling piece, this is the hardest one that I find for me to do. And in terms of thinking about, when people ask, like, how much time do I spend on each? I probably spend about 25% of my time directly selling, right? So the majority of my content is not, hey, work with me content. Okay. So, that's sort of how I show up. Other people show up differently, but in terms of how I show up, probably about less than 25% is, hey, work with me right now. And then last but not least, I would say the second, or actually for me, I would say the most of my content is probably teaching, coaching, and sharing resources. And this is just one example of one that did really, really well. I literally was giving out this little assessment in terms of speaking, and people really, really liked it. So to me, right, that was an indication. This was market research to show, hey, this is something that a lot of people want to have a conversation about. And I actually have an entire workshop I do on leveraging executive presence as it relates to pitching, specifically for startups, right? So that was for me, a really great way to build a new product. And I use this really as market research validation almost to, hey, this is something that people want and people need. All right. Just a quick reframe. If you're saying to yourself, hey, I can't do this, if you can reply to an email, especially if it has a lot of people CC'd or BCC'd, you can write a post or you can at least write a comment. And a key thing here is that comments can also get you a lot of visibility on LinkedIn as well, right? And that's why I always go back to, you don't have to create original content, right? You can comment on a page's post or another person's post and get a lot of visibility and also get a lot of sort of thought leadership, sort of, what would be the right word? A lot of people looking to you for your perspective, right? If you've done it in a really good way. Go ahead, Dahlia.
Quick question. So when I share, I get less visibility. So the number of people that have clicked on it versus when I post an original. And
that's correct.
Quick question.
That is
is
true.
There a setting difference, or is it just when I'm sharing somebody else's post, it's limited?
It's just when you're sharing somebody else's post when it's limited, but I don't think that should once again limit you from sharing. Okay. Because the key thing here is that people who like your content, once again, we don't know exactly how the algorithm works, but yes, you're right. When you do reshare somebody else's post on LinkedIn, you don't technically get as much reach, but because the people who follow you and engage with your content are more likely to see it, if it resonates with them and it makes sense for whatever type of strategy you have, I would recommend you go ahead and do that. So for example, I like to reshare things that relate to social proof. So when I do, workshops, a lot of times people take screenshots and share something about, hey, this was really great. Akua did this and it was really, fun. And I really enjoyed it. I'll reshare that. Will it get as much visibility as theirs? Probably not. But once again, I'm doing that because it's social proof. Yeah. Jill, please go ahead.
Yeah. And this may be too detailed of a question, but one of the things that I think is challenging is it's sometimes hard to see how people are actually engaging with your content. Because if you're not getting a comment or a like, you may not know. I'll oftentimes hear from people about, enjoying something that I may have shared on LinkedIn, but I never knew that they engaged with it. Is that something that, is that algorithm that you're talking about, or is there a way to really have a better idea of actually who's engaging and how many people are engaging with your content?
So that's a really great question. And that's honestly why I have this next slide, just because of that. So here's the thing. LinkedIn will show you some metrics. And I will say, if you've noticed in terms of the way in which I show up, I do look at numbers to a certain extent, but I don't think it's as important, especially if you are a one-on-one service provider or you're doing something that's not as scalable, right? And I keep giving that caveat because I think it's really important. And I also love to say, and I also always share this, is that the majority of people who actually pay me for my work do not engage with any of my content. They do not. But they do see it and they do say that they are inspired or uplifted or it gave them an alternative perspective. So LinkedIn, I think, will show you it's something related to number of impressions. Once again, like I said, typically when I do this, shorter presentation, I don't really get into it, but there are ways. And if you look at any of your posts, you can go and you can see the number of people that viewed it. You can see the number of comments you've gotten, and you also can see the number of likes that you've gotten as well. So it's just about going in and looking at your existing content and post. And I always recommend that you do that, especially if you've put together a strategy. So making sure that you go back within a timely manner to see, hey, like who engaged, what worked, what didn't. And so you can shift moving forward.
Great,
right?
Thank you.
Yeah, but I think once again, this slide just does a good job of, especially if you're not selling something that's mass market, reminding you that, hey, you're probably having an impact. You might be inspiring others, even if they don't like or comment. All right. And I'd love to pause here because I think have I technically run out of time? I think I have. I probably just want to double check with timing. Are we all okay to continue? Okay, great. So we just have one more. All right. the last question to ask yourself, right, as we go through this is, when's the last time you updated your profile? What was the last thing that you did on your profile? All right. So what I'm going to be sharing are the 5 top areas. I actually think it's 6. So I think I'm going to be sharing the top 6 areas that you should definitely keep in mind. And in terms of really thinking about your profile and auditing it, I think the biggest thing is just making sure that you have recommendations that are really relevant and that you're keeping your ideal decision maker in mind. And once again, when I talk about ideal decision maker or ideal client, what you're keeping in mind is the words that they'll be using, right? A lot of clients won't even necessarily use the words coach or coaching. And I know it's a really tough thing for some service providers to hear, but they might think of things from the perspective of, I want someone to support me with building a high performing team, right? So that's something a lot of my clients say. Or I want someone to help me, make sure that I'm spending time on the right task and responsibilities. They're not saying, hey, I want someone to coach me on productivity. So it's really important to understand what are the words that your ideal client or your ideal decision maker are using, because that might be what they're searching on LinkedIn or what might catch their eye in terms of the content that you're creating. All right. So really, I would suggest that you try to make the most of each part of your profile, but don't do it all at once. You really want to make sure that you create a process so you don't feel overwhelmed and that you're going back to it every so often, especially, if you're changing your strategy. And I also would recommend that you provide as much guidance as you can when you ask somebody for a recommendation. There will be times where someone will just recommend you out of the blue, out of the goodness of their heart, and that's great. Other times people do need to be prompted, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I'd recommend that you give them some guidance on how to do that. And I always love to ask specific questions around, what was your point A? What was your point B? What were the most important tools that you were able to build through working with me? Things like that can really go a long way to help people think about how to structure whatever recommendation that they put together for you. All right. In terms of the top 5 elements, I think that any new person looking at LinkedIn should focus on, right? And once again, all of you might be at different levels or at different places, but I really would recommend that you think about your headline, and I'll give some examples about that. Your banner, your picture. Once again, in terms of your banner and your picture, don't get worried about having, really, professionally looking photographs. Don't worry about having it be, designed by a graphic designer. There are great products out there that you can use that are free. I use Canva for everything. I take all my own pictures, and so I think it's definitely possible for you to do it on your own until you're ready to invest. I also recommend that you actually really make sure you make the most of your about section. And of course, also make sure your recommendations are the best they can be. And I, once again, will be sharing one additional area of interest. So this is one of the banners that I had earlier this year. In terms of the strategy I was going for, I was just putting together a series. I was just testing something out. And so I tried to make sure that everything in relation to how I was showing up on LinkedIn really was towards that. As you can see on my banner, I have my face. I have, really, I think, straightforward call to action. It's true, the banner is not clickable, but I do have a URL that's really short in there. And the reason why I like to do this is because I actually will put this URL in other parts of my profile. And I also put this URL and it will be clickable in my content as well. So I just wanted to make sure that this URL was everywhere, and I just posted it as many places as possible. The second thing that you'll see on here is my picture. You'll see a lot of people on LinkedIn have a similar type of, picture that's cut out with a color in the background. You can also leverage this picture to, have words in it, right? So there's, you'll see people that have maybe hire me in there. You can also use, something like Canva, once again, to put words in there if that's something that you want to do. I think it's really great real estate that can be leveraged, and really great real estate, once again, to reinforce whatever you're looking to reinforce. The last piece on here, and I'll move to the next slide for this because I think it really breaks it down, is my headline. All right. And one of the things I always love to share are like headline formulas. And so the way I like to think about headlines, right, if I'm looking at other people's headlines, is what do they put in it, right? What do I think the strategy is behind it? For me, one of the things that I thought was really important was to have something that's a little bit more visionary. And so for me, my headline is very much about what I try and practice, what I preach, what I want people to take away from working with me is that they can not only love themselves, but they can love their work, right? And ultimately love their lives, because we spend the majority of our times working, So that's what I love to sort of preach. That's sort of the angle I take with all of my content and even with my podcast. So that's sort of something that's really important to me. And, people will actually reach out and be like, hey, I really love that part of your headline. So it's something that really resonates. So I'd really recommend that's what you think about when you are putting together your headline. Other things that you can put in there, what you do. As you've probably have noticed, if you look at my current LinkedIn headline, I don't even put that I'm a coach. because for most people that doesn't really resonate. So if my ideal clients and my ideal decision makers, they don't even know what coaching really is. So I felt that was a waste of real estate. Another thing I also love to share, especially with coaches who are credentialed, is it doesn't always make sense to put your credential in your headline. It also doesn't always make sense to put your credential in your LinkedIn name. Because once again, unless your ideal decision maker or ideal client understands what those letters mean, it's wasted space, and you're better off putting something there that's going to resonate and putting something there, right, that's really going to grab their attention. So just really make sure you keep that in mind. Here are some other examples of what a headline can look like. And once again, what I did is just look at what some other people did and just picked out some things I thought were really cool. You can put a short URL in your headline, right? Once again, it's not necessarily going to be clickable, but at least it's there. And if someone's really interested, right, they can click on that. You can use emojis to help break things up if that's something that resonates with you. And then this last one that's here, I really like, right? This last one actually is from a coach. We were part of a group together, and I really love how he's so specific about who he works with. You know that he only works with finance and health-related professionals, and his headline shows that there. So if I was an ideal client, right, I think that's something that would really resonate. Be like, oh yeah, he can work with me. So I really would recommend, especially those of you maybe who are still working full time, to really think strategically about, okay, what do I want in my headline? And how can I make sure this is going to resonate with potential ideal decision makers or clients? This first one on here is something I used to have, and I used to put the previous job that I had, because the previous job I had was working for a high growth startup, and I work primarily with high growth startup founders and, you know, and C execs, right? So that's something that you can keep in mind if you think that's going to resonate. All right. Another thing, and this is the added piece, so this is technically the number 6, is what's described as the featured section. So LinkedIn has created this new sort of option where you can become a LinkedIn creator. And as a LinkedIn creator, you can get 2 additional sections to your profile. The first is that you can select hashtags that you typically write about. And the second is this featured section, right? And I believe you can still have a featured section in general, but one of the things I like to do with my featured section is making sure that I have images, right? And I have calls to action that are very straightforward and that people potentially would want to click on. I think this is a really great way visually, once again, beyond your banner, beyond your picture, to get people's attention.
And I can add that featured section without paying for
Correct.
LinkedIn service.
That's
Okay,
correct.
that's
Everything
awesome.
I'm sharing here is all free. Yes.
Cool. Thank you.
Correct. Yeah. In terms of your about section, and what I've done here is I've truncated it. And this is also what happens to your about section as well. It gets truncated. You don't get to see all of it. So I'd really recommend that the first, I think it's the first 3 lines of your about section, you make them incredibly actionable. In this case, what I've put is a sort of call to action to an opt-in that I have. If you don't have an opt-in, that's fine. What I'd recommend is that you really have a good tagline. You really have a good sort of mission statement or a vision statement that you think is really gonna, you know, attract people so that they click to read more, right? So what you don't see here is that there typically is a little ... read more or see more, right? And so really make the most of your, you know, your about section by having a really attention-grabbing beginning part. All right. The last thing I wanted to share in terms of thinking about your profile are what I describe as robust recommendations. So I actually have like a 7-step process that I take my clients through. I'm not going to go through every single part, but the key thing here is that I really would recommend, once again, that you make sure that you have people answer questions. And I actually will have people write the recommendation off of LinkedIn. So it's actually the process I use to create my testimonials for my website. I'll have them go through that process, and then I'll ask them, hey, like, thank you so much for going through this. Would you like to leave this on LinkedIn as a testimonial or recommendation as well? And then I will send my specific link. So everyone has a link to actually have their testimonial. They actually call it recommendations on LinkedIn. So I really would recommend that you think about doing that, simply because what that leads to, from my perspective, is more robust recommendations. Because from my perspective, especially as an executive or leadership coach, 1-line recommendations are not good social proof. If you take a look at my recommendations, you'll probably see I have 1 or 2, maybe that even have a few grammatical errors, but that was probably before I implemented my process. The majority of my recommendations, I will tell you, are actually on my websites versus on LinkedIn. And so sometimes I'll actually create content to drive people to my website to take a look at the rest of those testimonials. And I will also reuse those testimonials or repurpose or recycle those testimonials as images on LinkedIn as well. So really just think about making the most of your recommendations. And I think that for a lot of service providers, and I've audited hundreds of LinkedIn profiles of service providers, this tends to be, from my perspective, one of the biggest gaps. So create a process It's uncomfortable. I'll tell you, it's still uncomfortable, and I've been doing it for a bit, but I really think this is, once again, what's going to take your LinkedIn profile to the next level and really help to up level it, especially, once again, if you're selling one-on-one services and products that aren't necessarily as scalable. All right. So quick reframe here. If you've put together a CV or resume, you can complete your LinkedIn profile, right? And similar to putting together a CV or resume, you have a specific strategy, right? You have one intention, and that's to get the job. And that's really what you should think about in terms of whatever content you're creating and whatever presence, right, and profile you want to have on LinkedIn as well. All right. And the key thing to keep in mind here, and I hope you're not walking away from this conversation overwhelmed, is that there is power in taking those small steps. So really just recognizing that it's by having, right, just a little plan, a little process in place that's going to make it so much easier for you to do this into the future. Right. And you don't have to do it all at the same time, right? You can decide on which individual pieces you want to start with and how you really want to move forward. Okay. So honestly, if you take one thing away, right, I just really want you to see how easy it is for you to complete your LinkedIn profile and presence to help generate leads. And once again, you really need to think about it from that perspective of, right, do I have a book I'm trying to sell, right, which might be a little bit different from selling a one-on-one service or a program. Okay, so you don't need a massive personal branding agency. You don't need a professional photo shoot really to make it happen. All right. So the big question is, what are you going to start with first? All right. So that's honestly all I have to share with you all today. I am more than happy to stay on if anyone has any additional questions or thoughts, but thank you all so very much for joining me. Thank you.
You hit it on the mark. Thank you so much.
You are so, so welcome. Yeah. Any other questions? I was really trying to make sure that I was getting through all the different sort of intentions or strategies that everyone on here might have.
I will just add, I mean, for me, it was the comparison, and I tend to be a perfectionist. And so the comparison that others are posting this and others are writing articles and others. And so measuring myself, right, making sure I know what I want to do and who I am and not comparing myself to others. Yeah.
That's really, yeah, I really think that's the first step. Yes. Anyone else have any questions? Please go ahead, Phil. Oh, Phil's out. I do think I went over time. Anyone else, Carrie?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank you, Akua. I see that some people had to drop off because of a hard stop at 1 o'clock. And I do have another meeting, and I think that I logged in as the host. So if I drop off, it means everybody does. So we have a couple of options. I can just mute myself and the conversation can keep going on, or I can hop off the call, which is going to abruptly end all of us, unfortunately.
That's absolutely fine. I mean, if anyone has any additional questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Happy to answer any questions in the DMs, but it actually seems like everyone does have something to go to.
Yeah, it does.
I did take a little bit longer, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I really
You're
learned
so
a
welcome.
lot.
Yes.
I learned a lot about this whole LinkedIn. Like I said, I never really paid attention to LinkedIn, but I didn't even know you can really the marketing that can come with LinkedIn and so forth, other than, hey, I have a profile on LinkedIn and so forth. And I did like the way you made a distinction between understanding if you're there for business versus being an influencer, and understanding the balance between the two and the time that needs to be put in. And I think that was a really good insight for me, because you get to hear about so many different ways you can advertise yourself and put yourself out there. And like everyone else, it's like, oh, let me do this.
Yeah.
And like understanding, just like you said, quality over quantity. And being authentic. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. This really helped me out a lot.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that. And I know that you're sort of getting back into LinkedIn. Really would recommend that you maybe think about starting with your profile, and yeah, take it from there. But don't follow the influencers. I mean, they're great. Don't get me wrong, but I think they're selling something completely different. Let's just put it that way. It is not the same thing.
Yeah, I just think LinkedIn is more professional, and you leave the personal for Facebook and other arenas. So I agree. All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes. Bye.